Okay, so today we're going to go through the structures of the axial skeleton. You can see we have our guest of honor here with us today, and he's going to help us to look at the bones of the skull. And remember, the bones of the skull can be divided up into two categories. We have the cranial bones, and the cranial bones consist of the frontal bone, the two parietal bones, which you can see one here, and the other one is on the opposite side in this exact location, the temporal bones. Okay, again, there's another one like this on the opposite side, the occipital bone, which also has some interesting features on the inferior part of the skull. And then if we open up our friend's cranial vault here, we can see the ethmoid, at least part of the ethmoid here, and we can see part of the sphenoid bone here as well. Okay, so those are the bones that create this beautiful space that our brain resides in. Okay, I'm going to return the cranial vault to our skull. And let's start looking at the specific locations of the skull that you had, the landmarks associated with each bone. And I'm going to go in order from the lab sheet that I gave you so that you can follow right along with me. Okay, so again, here's our frontal bone, and that makes our forehead region. And if we look here, superior to the orbit, there's a little tiny opening, and this is the supraorbital foramen. Okay, and it is actually a foramen on this skull. Some of the skulls, it's a foramen on this side as well. Some of the skulls, remember, it will just be an indentation, and if it's an indentation, that's when you use the second term, the notch, to describe it. Okay, the parietal bone really has no landmarks associated with it. It's just a lovely curved flat bone, but we do have two sutures associated with it. One of those sutures is the coronal suture, and that is the suture that connects the frontal bone to the two parietal bones. Okay, and then we also have the sagittal suture. Okay, and the sagittal suture really is right at the mid-sagittal line, and it is the joint that connects the two parietal bones to each other superiorly. Okay, now sutures we haven't gone over in lecture yet, but sutures are a special type of joint, and the only place that you find them is in the skull. Okay, so now we're going to switch our focus to the temporal bone. Okay, and the temporal bone is this beautiful bone here. A lot of landmarks associated with the temporal bone. The first one is its suture, which is called the squamous suture. Okay, and then we have this beautiful extension of the temporal bone where it looks like it has a little arm that's reaching out to the face, and that little arm is the zygomatic process. Okay, now a process is usually a place where you have muscles attached. Okay, and this process happens to have muscles associated with mastication or chewing that are attached to it. Okay, on this skull, we're not going to see the mandibular fossa very well, so I'll skip that one and come back to it on another specimen. Okay, this large opening that you can see here is the external acoustic meatus, and that is the opening that leads to the ear canal. Okay, so your external ear would be here, and then you'd have this opening leading to the canal, and the canal would lead to your tympanic membrane. Okay. Next, we're going to flip over to the inferior surface, and we can see some landmarks of the temporal bone. Again, we're right over here in this area. Okay, so first we have this pointy piece of bone here, and there's another one on the other side. Each of these is referred to as a styloid process. Okay, now the styloid process looks like a little sharp tooth or fang, and there's one associated with each temporal bone. Again, it's a process, so it's a location for muscle attachment. Okay, then if we go posterior to that, we have this much larger process, which is the mastoid process. Okay, and the mastoid process we'll talk about again when we get to the muscular system, because this is an important location for muscle attachment. Specifically, it's the insertion point or movable end of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Now we're going to come back to our inferior view so we can look at two important openings. Okay, the first one that we're going to do is the jugular foramen, and that's a little hard to see with the mandible in place, so I'm going to remove the mandible here. Okay, I'm going to angle this now and get the spring out of the way. Okay, and you can see that on each side there's a very large opening, really kind of right where the temporal bone and the occipital bone meet each other. Okay, and that large opening is the jugular foramen. Okay, and the jugular foramen is the opening that the internal jugular vein passes through. Okay, so all of the blood that's draining from the cranial cavity eventually goes into the internal jugular vein on one side or the other, and that's what carries it out of the cranial cavity. Okay, now if there's blood coming out, that must mean that there's blood coming in, so there has to be an opening to let the blood come in. Okay, so that opening is right next door, and this is the opening of the carotid canal. It's called the canal because in a real skull, this opening would lead to a passageway that would go through the temporal bone in about this location. Okay, so it's also called carotid canal because it is the internal carotid artery that goes in through this opening and then through this passageway. Okay, and that is one of the major arteries that carries blood to our friend the brain. Okay, so we're going to switch to the occipital bone now. I'm going to flip the skull over so we can see that beautiful bone here on the posterior surface of the skull. Okay, and the suture associated with the occipital bone is the lambdoid suture. Okay, and I'm going to kind of direct your attention to this little area. You can usually see a very nice appearance of the bone here at the area of the lambdoid suture. It really shows you how these bones kind of knit together. Okay, so they describe the pattern of a suture as being interdigitated. And I'm going to put the skull down for just a minute and use my fingers. So this would be interdigitating. Okay, where you put your fingers together so that they're kind of interlocked in this way. Okay, and that's what you see in the suture. Okay, you see little pieces of one bone kind of poking in, and little pieces of the other bone poking in around them. So they just kind of interdigitate with each other and mesh together that way. So it makes a really strong bond, and that's why we have immovable joints in our skull. Okay? Now, the other two landmarks associated with the occipital bone, one in particular is very obvious. This is the foramen magnum. Remember that foramen means a round or oval opening in a bone. This definitely fits that category, and it's called magnum because it's the biggest. Okay, and this is the opening that allows your brain to connect with your spinal cord, because your spinal cord would be meeting the brain at this location. Okay, then we have these two kind of bean-shaped areas here that have nice smooth surfaces. These are the occipital condyles, and these locations are what rest against the first cervical vertebra to make a connection between your skull and one of the other sets of bones in the axial skeleton, the vertebral column. Okay. At this point, we're going to start looking inside the skull and into some other openings. I'm going to get my cranial vault off here so I'm ready. And we're going to start with the orbit of the where the space where the eye would be in a living individual. And we're going to look at a couple of structures associated with the sphenoid bone. Okay, now as you look into the eye of your friend, you should be able to see that there is one nice round opening. Am I in the right one? Yes, I am. Okay. And then there's one that's kind of long. Am I in the right place? Okay, good. One that's kind of long and more tear-shaped. Okay, so that longer opening that is tear-shaped is the superior orbital fissure. Okay, so fissure means that instead of being a nice round or oval opening, it's kind of a longer shape, more of a crack-like shape, which is what a fissure means. Superior because there is actually an inferior one, which we don't have on our list, and orbital because it's in the orbit. Okay, now the round opening is the optic canal, and both of these passageways, the superior orbital fissure and the optic canal, are openings for nerves to pass through. The superior orbital fissure allows both blood vessels and nerves that really connect to the muscles that allow us to move our eyes. And those are some cranial nerves, which we'll talk about in a few weeks. Okay? The optic canal allows the optic nerve to pass from the orbit into the cranial cavity. Okay, and that's what allows you to carry sensory information on vision to the brain. Okay, now I skipped over one, and we're going to look at that one now. The one I skipped over, we have to look inside the cranial cavity to find. Okay, and so here's our sphenoid bone again, and if you look right at the midline of the sphenoid bone, you find this little place where it kind of looks like somebody had a little ridge of bone and a little ridge of bone, and they pushed down in between and made a big depression here. Okay, and that structure with both of the ridges and the depression included is referred to as the sella turcica. Okay, now sella turcica actually means in Latin Turk's saddle or Turkish saddle. Okay, and you know, these anatomists, sometimes I feel like they must have not had much to do in the lab, so they were kind of coming up with whatever they could come up with to say, hey, this looks like something I saw in real life. And in this case, they decided that the sella turcica looked like the kind of saddles they had on the camels in Turkey. So they named it a Turk's saddle. Okay, now the depression is the space where your pituitary gland would be in your body. Now we're going to move on to the ethmoid bone, and we're going to stay in the cranial cavity because there's a couple of structures associated with the ethmoid bone that we can see well here. The structure that you see kind of pointing up right here, on this specimen it looks kind of roundish, but on others, I'll show you one on an actual human skull in a little while, and you'll see it has a different shape. This is the crista galli. Now, crista galli in Latin means rooster's comb. Okay, so again, these imaginative anatomists decided that this structure looked like that red piece that you see on the top of a rooster's head, the rooster's comb. Okay, and so they named it for that. Okay, now next to the crista galli, and I should say this is an attachment point for membranes that support the brain. Okay, now next to the crista galli is another important part of the ethmoid bone. These are the cribriform plates. Okay, so there's one on each side of the crista galli. Okay, and the cribriform plates look like they have, like somebody took this tool and just punched a bunch of openings in them. Okay, and the reason you have those openings is because this piece of bone is really what separates the cranial cavity from your nasal passages. So if you went through here, if you could microscopically size yourself and go through one of these openings, you'd end up in the nasal passages right at the place where your receptors for smell, for olfaction, are located. Okay, and so the openings allow the brain to connect to those receptors so that you have sensory information coming in about your special sense of smell. Okay, now as we turn, I know you wouldn't do this with your friends, but this is an accommodating friend, so we're going to look into our friend's nose at this point. And we're going to look at a couple of structures. I'm going to jump a little bit forward on the list just so we can see some structures together. So we're going to do the last structures of the ethmoid bone and a couple structures in the facial bone category as well. Okay, so we're going to start at the midline, and we're going to look at this structure here, and we're going to look at this structure here. Okay, now these two structures together make up what's referred to as the nasal septum. Okay, so you've probably heard of someone having a deviated septum, and if they do, that means that these two bones meet at an angle instead of being vertical as you see them here. Okay, now the superior one, the one that I'm indicating with the pointer right now, is part of the ethmoid bone, and this is actually the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Okay, the other part of the nasal septum, the one that is inferiorly located and is attached to the floor of the nasal passages, is the vomer bone. Okay, vomer in Latin means plow. Okay, and so this is an elongated, triangular shaped bone that looks a little bit like a plow blade. So that's how it got its name. Okay, so perpendicular plate of the ethmoid superiorly, the vomer inferiorly, and the two make up the nasal septum. Okay, now on the walls of our nasal passages, we can also see some bumps. Okay, now the bump that is closest to the floor of the nasal passages is the inferior nasal concha. Okay, now the inferior nasal concha is a separate bone that is considered one of the facial bones. Okay, the other two nasal concha are part of the ethmoid bone. Now, when you're looking in from this viewpoint, you can only see one of the concha on the ethmoid bone, and that is the middle nasal concha. Okay, so that structure that I'm touching right now with the pointer, can you get it? Okay, good. Is the middle nasal concha. Okay, and all of the nasal concha are there to give us more surface area so that as we're breathing in, we can have debris in our air kind of get swirled around as it's going past these concha and thrown up against the wall of the nasal passage, so any dirt or particles in it, pollen, bacteria, whatever, get stuck to the mucus and they don't get down into our lungs. Okay, so inferior nasal concha, middle nasal concha, perpendicular plate, vomer.